The pursuit of a life well lived is often mistaken for the acquisition of comfort. We assume that happiness resides in external rewards, in professional success, or in the elimination of friction from our daily lives. But the truth is far quieter and much more difficult to grasp. Our instinct is to build walls against pain, to smooth away every jagged edge of experience. Yet, history and philosophy teach us a profound contradiction, that it is precisely through friction, through struggle, that we forge character. To be truly resilient is not to avoid difficulty, it is to meet it with intention. We begin this journey by confronting the fundamental illusion of control. We spend our days reacting to emails, reacting to traffic, reacting to the sudden change in a person's mood. Our lives feel like a constant, breathless cascade of responses dictated by outside forces. We believe that if only we can predict the next event, if only we can arrange the world precisely as desired, then peace will arrive. But life is stubbornly chaotic. It does not yield to planning or neat little schedules. Consider the things we truly wish were controllable: other people's choices, the unpredictable weather, or the sudden pronouncements of fate. We build our identities and expectations upon these pillars of supposed control. When those external forces shift, when reality deviates from the comfortable script we wrote for ourselves, a deep sense of panic sets in. This is the first crack in the facade, the realization that much of what governs our emotional state lies entirely outside the reach of our will. The early stages of this philosophy are unsettling because they demand we relinquish comforting certainties. We must learn to differentiate between what is actually happening and how we interpret what is happening. This gap, the space between the event itself and the judgment we affix to it, is where all true freedom resides. An insult, for example, is merely a sound made by another person. The outrage you feel when hearing that sound is entirely yours. It is an internal commentary, a story you tell yourself about what was said. Until we understand this separation, we are slaves to our own immediate emotional responses. Imagine life not as a sequence of demands and disappointments, but as a continuous series of neutral data points. Failure is not a moral failing, it is information. A difficult conversation is not proof of enmity, it is practice in empathy. Anger is not a response to injustice. It is simply a chemical alarm signaling that something we value has been threatened. By stripping away the catastrophic judgment we automatically apply to these moments, we find ourselves standing on solid ground. We are no longer merely reacting, we are choosing. The mastery of self, therefore, is less about achieving grand victories and more about cultivating micro-moments of conscious resistance. It begins when an unpleasant situation arises, a delay, a criticism, a sudden injustice, and instead of spiraling into the familiar pattern of distress, something shifts within us. We are taught to create an intentional space, a deliberate pause that feels awkward, almost unnatural. This small gap is revolutionary because it intercepts the automatic impulse. In those seconds, when the initial hot surge of feeling attempts to seize control, we are forced to ask a single, penetrating question. Is this judgment based on fact or merely on expectation? The challenge becomes one of rigorous mental discipline. We must voluntarily choose discomfort. If comfort has become our primary goal, then any deviation, the chill of cold air, the exhaustion of physical exertion, the lack of immediate validation, feels like a profound threat. But these small doses of voluntary hardship are not punishments. They are training weights for the spirit. They teach us that we possess an inner source of stability that is utterly independent of external conditions. This ongoing process requires us to become keenly attuned observers. We begin observing our own internal landscape, watching how quickly and effortlessly our thoughts create narratives of victimhood or inevitability. When those judgmental thought patterns rise, "This cannot happen. I deserved better. It must be unfair." We treat them like poorly constructed theories needing correction. We remind ourselves that the only thing truly in our power to command is the quality of our assent, the manner in which we agree with or disagree with the passing notion. The path is not paved with sudden epiphanies, but with the accumulation of countless small choices. The choice to breathe slowly when anger demands a shout, the choice to accept an imperfection that once seemed intolerable. It is about recognizing the boundary between self and world. The world will continue its grand sweep, full of noise, complexity, and unpredictable human frailty. But within us, there can be established a quiet sovereignty, a citadel of rational judgment, unbreachable by mere circumstance. This is not a destination to arrive at, but a steady, mindful practice to maintain every day, making conscious choice our default setting. The quiet room smelled of aged paper and polished wood. It was a place removed from the digital clamor that had defined Leo's life, a silent sanctuary where the only sound was the gentle turning of brittle pages. He sat in a worn armchair, feeling exposed, as if every anxious thought he had ever held were floating just above his head, waiting to be critiqued by someone else. Across from him sat an older man, whose eyes seemed to hold the weight and stillness of countless histories. This mentor spoke little, but when he did, his words resonated with a steady, undeniable current, a stream of logic dressed in kindness. Leo listened, expecting some grand epiphany, perhaps a magical formula for instant peace. But what arrived was far more challenging. The mentor didn't offer answers. He presented questions that demanded an internal excavation. He spoke about the gap, the profound chasm between perception and reality. We construct our lives upon these perceived realities, the timelines of missed appointments, the sharp words spoken in haste, the professional slight, and we treat them as if they were granite facts. But the truth, he implied, is that our suffering does not come from the event itself, but from the story we attach to it. The mentor paused, letting the weight of that idea settle like dust. He continued by asking Leo to consider something simple. How often do you assume a future outcome based on today's feelings? We build entire emotional scaffolding around predictions. If this happens, then I will feel dread. If that fails, then my worth is diminished. This reliance on imagined futures is the source of so much unearned anxiety. It is living in perpetual draft, always bracing for a wind that may never blow. One afternoon, the mentor proposed an exercise. He asked Leo to deliberately create a small moment of mild discomfort. Not something dangerous, but simply something inconvenient. Perhaps spending time in a slightly cooler room than he preferred, or confronting a repetitive, tedious task that offered no immediate reward. The goal was not endurance for its own sake, but to observe the judgment associated with that discomfort. When faced with minor inconvenience, Leo's initial reaction was immediate resistance. He wished it away, mentally composing an excuse for why this moment should not exist or how it should change. It was a desperate grasping at comfort, a refusal to simply be in the present skin of the moment. The mentor watched this struggle unfold with patient eyes. "You are resisting the fact that you merely have to be," he finally murmured. "You mistake mere difficulty for moral injury. You believe that if you remove the inconvenience, you will restore your sense of control or happiness. But the universe does not owe you comfort simply because you deserve peace." This idea, that the simple act of enduring something neutral was a philosophical challenge in itself, hit Leo with surprising force. He spent the next weeks trying to apply this principle. If he felt anxious about an approaching deadline, instead of spiraling into worst-case scenarios, he forced himself to write down only what was factually certain. What is absolutely guaranteed to happen within the next hour? The phone will buzz. I must reply by noon. Sunlight hits the windowsill. These small anchors were immensely liberating, stripping away layers of speculative dread. The mentor then introduced a deeper layer: expectation. We are master architects of our expectations, and yet we treat them like sacred laws. We expect that if we put in enough effort, success will follow automatically. We expect that loving people will always understand our needs without us having to speak them. When reality deviates from this finely tuned script of expectation, the resulting disappointment feels catastrophic, almost criminal. The pain is so intense it blinds us, making us feel victimized by circumstances or even by others' imperfections. You must learn that between the event and your reaction, the mentor explained gently, there exists a space. This gap, it is where freedom resides. People mistake time passing for control. But this pause, this sacred fraction of seconds before you speak, before you flinch, before you judge, is your true power. Leo practiced recalling that moment, visualizing the tiny sliver of quiet breath between stimulus and response. It felt impossibly far away at first, like standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking an endless chasm. His natural tendency was always to rush into the drop, swept up by emotion, defensive anger, sharp regret, overwhelming panic. But the mentor insisted he stop, just for a breath, to acknowledge the input but refuse to immediately generate the output. This required a constant, exhausting act of self-restraint. He began applying this pause in daily interactions. When a colleague made an unnecessarily sarcastic comment, his old reflex was a defensive snap, a witty retort designed solely to wound back. Now he felt only that brief, agonizing silence. He would count silently, 1, 2, 3, and then he would choose a response of neutrality. A simple, calm acknowledgement, I hear what you say. This radical refusal to engage in emotional combat was draining but fundamentally transformative. The process became less about willpower and more about recognizing patterns. Leo started noting the triggers, the specific tones of voice, the types of criticism, the feeling of being overlooked, and treating them not as indictments of his character, but merely as predictable data points. They were information that simply needed to be observed, categorized, and dismissed as non-threatening. The quiet room thus became more than just a place for philosophy. It became a crucible for self-discovery. Leo realized that true strength was never found in the ability to prevent difficulty or injustice from happening in the world. It was found only in mastering the space between what happens and how he chooses to respond to it. This stillness, cultivated piece by difficult piece, was the hardest, yet most profoundly liberating journey of all. The training continued, not in a room filled with whispers and lofty concepts, but in the relentless stream of everyday life. What Leo had learned was profound, yet its true test was merely showing up for the next moment. To become truly resilient, he could not simply meditate. He had to live through imperfection. The intellectual understanding of control, the notion that freedom rested only in choosing one's internal response, felt solid enough in theory. But theory offers no defense against a sudden downpour or the sharp words of a frustrated stranger. Our struggle now was the expectation itself. It is not merely anticipating pain. It is the deep-seated habit of building an emotional house upon shifting sand, a structure based on how we believe things should go. We spend so much energy trying to construct perfect futures, rigid timelines, and predictable outcomes that when reality inevitably deviates from this plan, the ensuing shock is crippling. It feels not just disappointing, it feels fundamentally unjust. The mentor guided him back to the core concept of separation. Not what happens, but how he anticipates it. He asked Leo to deliberately invite worry into his mind, to visualize failure, to model rejection, and then observe the subsequent physical and emotional reaction. This was uncomfortable work because worrying itself is a form of self-inflicted suffering. The most difficult part of this trial was that fear had become its own master. The anxiety was not about the event at all. It was about the disruption caused by the deviation from expectation. If he missed his train, the anger was not for the delay itself, but for the fact that the delay would disrupt his meticulously planned day. The mentor pressed him. Leo, you are building an empire of what might be, but empires built on what might be crumble at the first breath of reality. He showed him that anticipation, while a useful tool for planning, becomes a corrosive force when it is treated as absolute truth. It turns possibility into inevitability. He began by challenging small, harmless expectations. Will the cafe open on time? Will this interaction flow smoothly? Initially, he fought these little mental battles fiercely. His mind was trained to predict A, and when B happened, a spike of frustration would pierce his calm facade. He felt himself slipping backward into old patterns, the impulse to correct, to manage, to control the narrative. The mentor suggested an exercise in preemptive surrender. When facing something he dreaded or worried about, Leo was instructed simply to acknowledge the possibility without engaging with it emotionally. To say, it is possible this will go badly, and if it does, I am prepared for that reality. This wasn't resignation. It was a rational disarmament. By accepting the worst-case scenario in advance, the emotional shock of its arrival lost its devastating power. He started to see how much mental oxygen he was wasting. Every moment spent rehearsing potential disasters was a moment stolen from being fully present. He realized that his expectations were not shields protecting him. They were actually shackles, binding him to an imagined reality that did not exist. This insight brought a new kind of pain, the slow, painful dissolution of his own deeply held belief in predictability. The world, he discovered, was inherently messy and indifferent to human plans. And for the first time, facing this magnificent indifference, Leo felt a profound sense of spaciousness. If nothing could be guaranteed except the present second, then the only thing that truly mattered was the quality of attention he gave to it. The work became intensely personal, moving from abstract philosophy into behavioral training. It wasn't enough to know that an event outside his control exists. He had to practice ignoring its potential influence on his inner state. He learned to mentally build a buffer, a cushion of indifference, between the trigger and the response. The greatest struggle remained internal, recognizing when he was simply using rational thought as an excuse for deep-seated resistance. Sometimes, a minor inconvenience would trigger a disproportionately large burst of worry, leading him to question if he had truly broken free from the gravitational pull of expectation. It required painstaking effort, like reshaping a stubborn muscle that had atrophied from neglect. The goal was not flawless calm. That is an illusion itself. The goal was continuous return. To fail, to get swept away by worry, and then simply noticing that failure, gently bringing his attention back to the present moment. That act of observation, repeatedly performed, became the truest form of freedom. It meant accepting uncertainty, recognizing it not as a void to be feared, but as the very texture of life itself. And in embracing that beautiful, terrifying ambiguity lay the core of true stoic power. The initial breakthrough was a dizzying revelation. He had begun to see that so much of his suffering was built not by the world itself, but within the architecture of his own mind. For weeks, he had spent countless hours tracing the invisible lines that separated stimulus from judgment. It became clear. There existed a profound divide, a vast gulf between what happened to him and how he decided it meant. To realize this gap felt less like wisdom and more like an unexpected, staggering weight. The mentor did not offer slogans or comforting platitudes. Instead, he presented geometry. He asked Leo to visualize the limits of his influence. This was the lesson of the circle. Imagine drawing a perfect ring in the dust. There is the outer boundary, and then there is the space contained within it. The initial task seemed deceptively simple, yet its philosophical weight was immense. The mentor explained that anything outside this drawn circle, the sudden downpour, another person's careless words, the volatile swing of fortune, the policies enacted by powerful hands, belonged irrevocably to the outer circumference. These things were simply events, happening and passing like clouds across a sky indifferent to his worries. He could observe them, he could accept their presence, but they were not his domain. They were uncontrollable. Conversely, everything within the inner core of that circle, the conscious choices of his mind, the pause between feeling and acting, the decision to meet difficulty with reasoned contemplation, that was solely his own province. This realization was, paradoxically, both an enormous burden and a miraculous release. It gave him boundaries, but more importantly, it offered sovereignty. The natural human tendency is to grasp at every variable, to try and pull back at the outer edges of the circle, believing that if he just understands the weather pattern or can predict the actions of every person around him, then peace will finally settle in. But attempting this only resulted in exhaustion, a feverish grasping at smoke. The mentor guided his focus inward, into the geometry of self-mastery. He taught Leo to become a master cartographer of his own internal landscape. When a difficult event occurred, perhaps traffic snarled unexpectedly, or an acquaintance made a slight remark that pricked at old wounds, the instinctual mind wanted to immediately blame, argue, or anticipate retribution. This was the old reflex, the urge to try and change the external world through sheer force of will. The philosophical task now was retraining his attention. When anger flared, he did not follow the impulse. He performed a mental drawing in his mind, identifying the stimulus on the outside ring, acknowledging it without ownership, and then forcing his conscious awareness back into the secure inner core. His response became an act of physical will, a deliberate choice divorced from emotional reaction. This was challenging work because human emotions are designed for immediacy. They reward reaction. The moment required patience that felt unnatural, like holding breath while running a race. He found himself standing on the precipice of minor confrontations, where every fiber in his being screamed for an immediate defense. But he resisted, anchored by the image of that quiet circle. The core insight was this: freedom does not mean controlling outcomes, it means owning your self-judgment. The event is neutral data, a raindrop hitting pavement. But the judgment, the complaint, the frustration, the bitterness, is what turns that data into pain. He began to see life through this detached lens. Was the delay truly malicious, or was it simply a consequence of more vehicles operating on limited space? Were the careless words an attack, or merely the flawed expression of another person's internal discomfort? The mentor insisted that he must practice negative visualization, not as worrying about doom, but as preemptive mental rehearsal. He would spend time deliberately imagining scenarios where things went wrong, where a project failed, or where a relationship faltered due to external factors beyond their control. By accepting the possibility of failure before it happened, the emotional shock when it eventually arrived was diminished. The feared outcome lost its power because he had already mentally visited it and found that being okay even then. This systematic acceptance transformed anxiety from a frantic prediction into a calm acknowledgement. He learned to reframe inevitability not as tragedy, but as raw material for practice. Life would always unfold outside the perfect boundaries of his control circle. Therefore, his only reliable place of refuge, and thus the source of all enduring power, was within his own reasoned assent. This defined not merely what he could do, but who he fundamentally chose to be. The struggle to remain calm in the face of provocation is perhaps the hardest mountain any man will ever climb. We are taught, from childhood and through culture, that our immediate reaction is what defines us. It is swift, visceral, and fueled by the primal need to defend ourselves or restore fairness. But this instant impulse, this surge of hot blood and indignation, is also often inaccurate. In Chapter 4, we learned where true control resides, not in the outcome, but in our assent. We built the outer ring of potential chaos around a protected inner core of judgment. Yet, when tested by real life, theory dissolves into raw impulse. This moment arrives like an electric shock. It is small, often invisible to others, yet it feels massive and deeply personal to the one experiencing it. Imagine the simple frustration of being cut off in traffic, of hearing a dismissive remark that wounds with surgical precision, or facing an injustice that simply defies all reason. Our mind does not process this as merely annoying. It processes it as a threat, a violation, and our default setting is anger. The instant the stimulus hits, the body primes itself for fight or flight. The heart rate increases, adrenaline surges, and thought feels momentarily distant, relegated to some slow-moving second observer. We feel that urgent need, the burning desire to retaliate, to prove a point, to make the offending party understand the magnitude of their mistake. This automatic rush toward reaction is powerful because it bypasses the reasoning mind entirely. It was in these moments of near eruption that the lessons of detachment and pause became vital, painful commandments. We had learned about recognizing what we could not control: the speeding car, the careless word, the capricious whim of another human being. But knowing this intellectually is a thing. Embodying it in the heat of confrontation is quite another discipline entirely. My mentor taught us to locate a gap, a space between the initial sting and the ensuing action. That pause was not an option. It felt like losing altitude, like having the ground drop out beneath our feet. It required a level of mental effort that was exhausting, even terrifying. To consciously veto the deeply ingrained response, to say to the burning passion lodged in the chest, "Stop. Wait." The process is one of deep self-interrogation when under duress. What does this anger truly represent? Is it merely about the cut-off car, or is it about feeling disrespected? Is it about the harsh comment, or is it about a deeper fear of not being heard? By forcing oneself to analyze the source of the rage rather than simply reacting to the surface trigger, we begin to see that anger often serves as a poorly aimed arrow, striking at an old wound instead of the immediate aggressor. The temptation in these moments is profound. The easiest path is always confrontation, yelling, arguing, defending oneself fiercely until exhaustion. This seems like justice, but it is merely satisfying an emotional craving for dominance or acknowledgement. But true freedom comes from resisting that very craving. It demands choosing a less satisfying, but infinitely more potent, response. This struggle to delay the natural reaction builds extraordinary internal musculature. We are not simply learning self-control, we are learning self-sovereignty. We recognize that our inner world, our judgments, our interpretations, our assent, is utterly inviolable by external circumstance. The car may cut us off, and others may speak carelessly, but they cannot invade the citadel of our judgment. They can only present a stimulus. The work moves from understanding failure to embracing it as necessary data. We realize that when we choose wisdom over immediate satisfaction, we might lose an argument, or perhaps even miss an opportunity for confrontation. This is acceptable, because by choosing the difficult path, the reasoned silence, the detached observation, we secure something far more valuable than victory, the unshakable knowledge of our own rational capacity. This moment requires treating emotion not as truth, but as mere weather passing through us. It is turbulent, powerful even, yet temporary and impersonal. The goal shifts from eliminating anger to incorporating it safely, to acknowledging its presence, to naming it, observing it, and allowing the observation itself to become the mechanism of release. This disciplined stillness, practiced repeatedly in the fires of daily life, carves out a space for true peace. It is not an absence of pain. It is the mastery over how that pain shapes us. The lesson seemed impossibly simple, and yet overwhelmingly difficult. The mentor had shown him the gap, the silent space between a feeling arriving in the chest and the mouth forming an answer. Before this moment, Leo had treated emotion as an automatic circuit. Stimulus causes reaction. It was seamless, brutal, immediate. He reacted to criticism with defensiveness. He responded to inconvenience with sharp frustration. These reactions were old companions, reliable yet draining. The mentor did not simply tell him to breathe. Instead, he gave him the task of counting, 3 seconds, 3 slow, intentional breaths where nothing happened. Nothing was permitted to happen except the pause itself. This 3-second pause felt less like a technique and more like an unnatural architectural intervention in his nervous system. At first, it felt agonizingly long. When a minor annoyance, a misplaced item, a delay of minutes, a perceived slight from a stranger would strike him, the impulse to snap back was overwhelming. His mind wanted to fill the void instantly. It needed conflict to feel real. It preferred the rush of adrenaline over the quiet discipline of reflection. The inner battle was exhausting. He would rehearse negative scenarios in his head, anticipating the flashpoint. The unfairness, the misunderstanding, the cold indifference of others. And then, when the stimulus arrived, the sudden buzz of a phone message that demanded immediate emotional accountability, or the unexpected tone of voice from a loved one, he had to execute the pause. The seconds stretched into eternities. The initial impulse to lash out would surge up his throat, hot and toxic. He could feel the muscle tension in his jaw, the rapid thrumming against his ribs that signaled impending emotional release. And then he practiced nothing, just space. Silence. He was trained to be an instant responder. Now he had to become a mindful delayer. The mentor observed this with quiet patience. "You are not delaying the reaction," the old man murmured one afternoon. "You are creating room for reason to enter. Reaction assumes that your emotions are truth. The pause reminds you that they are merely signal." It was profound in its simplicity and terrifying in its demand. To remain motionless when every fiber of his being demanded flight or fight. This required a kind of mental stillness he had never known existed. It meant observing the anger, not engaging with it. Imagining the heat of frustration cresting, watching the telltale flush creep up his neck, and then letting it simply crest, dissipate, and pass without judgment, without fuel. He started applying this pause in small, low-stakes encounters. A slow line at a coffee shop, a minor misunderstanding with a co-worker about a deadline. The initial attempt was clumsy. He would physically stumble, breathing heavily as if he had just run a mile. People around him would give him looks of mild bewilderment, seeing the sudden suspension in his usual fast tempo. The realization that followed these pauses was transformative. When he did not react immediately, the world did not collapse. The minor inconvenience remained an inconvenience. It simply ceased to be an emergency demanding his emotional allegiance. He discovered a power within this very slowness, the ability to treat external events as merely information, requiring assessment rather than instant armament. The internal monologue became his most rigorous teacher. Instead of allowing the raw feeling, the "I am angry" or "I feel dismissed," to dictate his words, he forced himself through a cascade of questions. Is this truly under my control? Is reacting now solving anything? What is the rational, objective outcome versus the emotionally gratifying one? The weight of choice settled upon him. He was not merely choosing to wait, he was choosing principle over passion. He was constructing an inner edifice, brick by painstaking brick, using self-restraint as his mortar. This practice revealed that his greatest energy expenditure had previously been spent on maintaining reactive momentum, on the emotional echo chamber of constant response. To pause 3 seconds meant admitting a vulnerability. It signaled to others that he could be challenged without fracturing. And in accepting this temporary stillness, Leo found not weakness, but an unshakable sovereignty. The true gift was not conquering anger entirely, but mastering the moment immediately preceding it, the sacred interval where will encounters reality. He learned that freedom was not found in external comfort or perfect understanding, but in cultivating the quiet discipline to breathe into the space between what happens and how he chooses to answer it. This pause, this breath, became his unshakable center. The last few chapters had taught him the difficult architecture of the mind. He learned that peace was not a state achieved by avoidance, but one earned through confrontation. He understood the precious gap between stimulus and reasoned response. But knowledge, he found, remained an abstract concept until it met resistance in the physical world. The mentor pressed him on this point, suggesting an exercise designed to shatter his reliance on comfort, to build a mind that was not merely philosophically equipped, but physically hardened against ease itself. The assignment was simple, yet profoundly challenging, embracing discomfort, and specifically cold. He approached the task with intellectual rigor. He analyzed the physics of temperature loss, the biological necessity of warmth, and the cultural assumption that comfort equals safety. His mind sought a loophole in the logic. How could he philosophize his way out of a freezing river? This preparation only served to highlight the inadequacy of pure theory. When the moment came, standing by the edge of the water, the chill was not merely environmental. It felt personal. It targeted the deep-seated emotional aversion to difficulty that lay beneath all his previous victories. Stepping in was an act of will against instinct. The initial shock was a physical assault, a sharp intake of breath, immediate tension seizing every muscle, and the urge to retreat with desperate speed. This sudden distress triggered not philosophical contemplation, but raw survival reflex. In the minutes that followed, his rational mind struggled desperately to maintain purchase on the discipline he had so carefully constructed over weeks of training. The burning sensation spread through him, a visceral reminder of his body's natural law. Seek warmth, avoid pain. He found himself cataloging discomfort as if it were an enemy to be overcome by mental force. This was faulty reasoning, treating the cold itself as the problem. The mentor's words echoed in the deepening numbness. Examine the judgment you are making about this coldness. Is the danger in the temperature, Or is the danger in your refusal to feel any discomfort at all? To avoid the sensation is merely to postpone confrontation with the self. He forced himself to stay submerged longer than he felt safe. He started focusing not on the sharp edges of the pain, but on the continuity of the experience. The water was simply a constant input of sensory data, a neutral fact. It did not judge him, it did not react to his fear, and therefore he could not treat it as an emergency. The effort required was immense. Every minute felt like a choice against self-preservation. He observed the instinctive panic in others around him, the flurry of complaints, the desperate calls for help. They were trapped by their immediate physical needs, unable to detach themselves from the stimulus. But he continued to draw focus inward, practicing radical acceptance not just of difficult emotions, but of objectively unpleasant sensations. He realized that his previous exercises with anger and expectation had been primarily mental battles. These required sustained attention, complex reasoning, and willpower over time. The cold demanded something more primal, pure, uninterrupted fortitude. It stripped away the veneer of sophisticated thought and tested the bedrock of acceptance itself. The narrative shifted from conquering a fleeting emotion to enduring a constant state. This was an education in neutrality. He practiced seeing the discomfort not as proof of weakness, but as neutral information. The cold did not care how strong he felt. It simply existed. And by accepting its existence without resistance, without arguing against it or wishing it away prematurely, he began to dismantle his deeply ingrained preference for ease. The lesson was profound. Resilience is not the absence of pain, but the ability to remain reasoned while enduring it. It required him to treat the discomfort not as a threat, but merely as input data that demanded an observation, not an emotional outburst. This shift in perspective allowed him eventually to recognize when the time had come for withdrawal, not out of defeat, but from rational assessment of his physical limits. Leaving the water was almost easier than staying in it. Yet the true challenge lay in carrying the internal state back to dry land. The cold was gone, but its imprint remained. A deeper understanding etched into his pattern recognition. He saw that the greatest luxury is not warm beds or soft blankets, but the unwavering capacity of mind to remain unmoved by circumstance. The physical discomfort had served as a crucible, refining the principles he had learned through conversation and contemplation into something undeniable. Internal mastery was attainable even when the body screamed for surrender. The journey toward inner peace was not a sudden flash of enlightenment, but a slow, arduous climb out of the deep valley of reaction. Having learned to pause, to create that crucial gap between stimulus and response, Leo started to feel a new kind of struggle. It was no longer the fight against external chaos, but the resistance within his own mind. He realized that he had been treating pain as something inherently terrible, an enemy to be defeated or avoided at all costs. But what if this assumption itself was the primary source of suffering? To truly become unshakable, he needed to confront not just external discomfort, but the deepest narratives he carried about his own emotional pain. The next challenge demanded a radical shift in perspective, viewing emotional and physical hardship not as unique attacks, but merely as neutral information. This concept challenged every ingrained habit of his mind. The reflex to shrink from difficulty, the automatic labeling of disappointment as catastrophic, or loss as an unbearable void. He was guided back to fundamental philosophical principles, recalling the wisdom that everything encountered by us is simply data awaiting rational interpretation. He began to apply this framework to memories, sitting quietly and methodically dissecting moments of past failure, deep embarrassment, or sudden heartbreak. These memories were no longer flashes of acute agony, they became intellectual case studies. He observed the pain itself, the sharp edges of regret, the dull ache of unfulfilled potential, and detached himself from it. He asked himself, is this sensation painful, or is my judgment about this sensation that makes it painful? The profound difference was often startling. He realized that when he reacted to a past failure by saying, "I am inadequate," he was not engaging with the mere fact of the poor performance. He was accepting the story that accompanied the fact. Similarly, the physical sting of cold or the deep frustration of being ignored were easily misinterpreted as personal assaults on his worth. They were simply occurrences, data points in the continuous stream of existence. The practice became a form of emotional triage. Instead of running from memories of discomfort, he sat with them like an investigator examining evidence. He accepted that suffering was not itself a moral failing or proof of bad fortune. It was merely friction, the necessary byproduct of life moving through time and encountering resistance. By stripping away the labels of terrible, shameful, or unbearable, he found the painful subject matter to be surprisingly inert. It lacked inherent emotional power until his mind latched onto it with judgment. This intellectual breakthrough marked a pivotal turning point in his development. If pain was neutral, then how could he lose himself in the narrative of despair? He began treating every negative emotion, from lingering anxiety to acute frustration, as nothing more than raw data. Data that requires analysis, filing away, and rational reframing. The feeling itself was acceptable. It simply needed a factual description, not an emotional pronouncement. The implications were vast. If he could treat failure as neutral information, then the opportunity for recovery remained equally neutral, stripped of any expectation or attached hope. He found that this detachment did not lead to apathy, but to a profound and focused clarity. It gave him the freedom to act decisively because his actions were guided by reason and principle, rather than being dictated by fear or wounded pride. The mental fortitude built through this process allowed him to carry weightier burdens. When setbacks occurred in the external world, a business disagreement, a professional rejection, he no longer experienced them as personal verdicts on his character. Instead, they became observable phenomena. Event A happened, followed by my assessment B, which led to emotional consequence C. By treating all three elements as neutral information, he preserved his internal equilibrium. The discipline transformed him from merely resisting bad events into actively processing the reality of every event. He learned that embracing ambiguity, accepting that some outcomes are genuinely indeterminate and cannot be predicted or controlled, was not resignation, but the highest form of intellectual mastery. His emotional life became less volatile, anchored by a principle far more solid than any fleeting feeling. The understanding that within all discomfort, there lies only information waiting for wisdom's steady gaze. This realization did not promise happiness, for happiness remained elusive and transient, but it delivered something infinitely more valuable, an unassailable inner freedom. The last chapters had taught him the geometry of control. He knew where his circle ended and the unpredictable currents of the world began. But knowledge, he realized, was merely a map. It did not promise safe passage through the river itself. The next lesson required something quieter, more intimate, and far harder to sustain: gratitude. He found himself sitting cross-legged on the worn floor, facing a blank sheet of paper and a pen. This was not the bracing challenge of cold water, nor the controlled discipline of enduring anger. It was simply inventory. a life audit. He felt initial resistance, treating this simple act like another performance to be mastered. Why count blessings? Didn't he already know that nothing good came by accident or pure chance? Was acknowledging grace merely sentimental fluff? The mentor watched him, silent as always, embodying the vast quiet of acceptance. There was no lecture to listen to, only the expectation of presence. This lack of stimulation forced Leo to dive deeper into his own interior landscape. He began by listing things he took for granted: the easy flush of water from a tap, the consistent rise and fall of breath, the quality of light filtering through dust motes in the late afternoon. At first, his thoughts scattered like fallen leaves, the overdue bill, the slight tension knotting his shoulder muscles, the harsh words spoken yesterday. He felt the seductive pull of distraction, wanting to intellectualize past failures or future worries instead of simply listing what was. But he pushed back against this impulse. The goal was not a psychological debriefing. It was an act of radical recognition. It forced him to anchor his consciousness firmly in the present moment, where nothing could be lost and nothing could yet disappoint. He thought about health. Not merely the absence of illness, but the simple, profound ability to move without sharp pain. The gift of eyes that still saw color, even if those colors were muted by fatigue or time. These mundane gifts, they had become invisible anchors in his modern life, lost beneath the noise of efficiency and ambition. He wrote down memories: the taste of rain on dry earth after a long drought, the unexpected shared laughter with strangers in a passing moment, the reliable rhythm of sunrise. Each entry was not just an item on a list. It was a defiant acknowledgement of sustaining grace. It required him to slow down time, to notice the subtlest threads of sustenance weaving through his days. The process became a deep excavation, revealing layers of profound thankfulness he had previously deemed too obvious or too small to matter. He realized that suffering often blinds us not just to major tragedies, but to the continuous flow of minor boons: the steady electricity in the wall socket, the unexpected kindness of a merchant's smile, the warmth radiating from sun-drenched stone. This was more potent than merely achieving emotional neutrality. It wasn't just about surviving pain. It was about recognizing that life itself, in its messy, imperfect flow, is an astonishing gift. This deep sense of appreciation acted as a philosophical adhesive, pulling him back toward the ground truth: this moment. The future remains uncertain, the past cannot be undone, but the breath entering and leaving his lungs right now, that was a definitive, unassailable present. The weight of this awareness settled over him, replacing the frantic energy of self-improvement with a quiet awe. It was a shift from striving to simply being. The inventory taught him that detachment, while essential, was incomplete without appreciation. One could be emotionally detached and yet remain entirely impoverished if one did not remember what sustained them in the first place. The mentor finally spoke, his voice barely disturbing the settled dust motes in the light beam. He said nothing about advanced techniques or new adversities. He simply pointed to the completed paper, filled with careful lists of gratitude. He stated that having mastered the control of response, the gap, the pause, Leo was now mastering perspective itself. True resilience, he murmured, did not come from never encountering difficulty. It came from recognizing the abundance surrounding you even when everything feels difficult. This practice of gratitude transformed Stoic philosophy from a mere technique for coping with adversity into a deep appreciation for existence itself. It rooted his inner fortress in the undeniable beauty and tenacity of simple daily life, completing his journey not with a dramatic triumph over fate, but with a profound, steady heartfulness. The principles of detachment and controlled response had not been learned in the sterile quiet of a room. They were skills meant for the friction of life, for moments where reason felt heavy and resistance was primal. Leo understood this now. He had passed through theory, acquiring an inner vocabulary filled with concepts like reasoned assent, neutral information, and the precious value of the pause. But merely knowing these words did not equate to mastery. His true test lay in connection. It resided in relationships, in the deeply messy, unpredictable space where another human being's imperfect heart intersects with your own carefully constructed peace. The mentor had prepared him for external chaos, the cold shock of the water, the relentless pressure of a deadline, the disappointment of loss. But he hadn't quite prepared him for the difficult conversation. The day arrived like an unavoidable reckoning. It involved Clara, a friend whose history with Leo was woven with threads of mutual affection and recurring discord. She wasn't actively hostile, but she operated from a place of deep-seated misunderstanding, a pattern of defensive behavior that always chipped away at the stability he had fought so hard to build. Their meeting spot, a familiar coffee shop corner, felt charged, an open stage for old wounds and unspoken grievances. Leo approached it not with defensiveness or the practiced detachment he used on strangers in traffic, but with a profound sense of vulnerability that felt almost dangerous. He knew better than ever how seductive the old emotional reactions were. They promised quick release, immediate catharsis through righteous anger or hurt withdrawal. As Clara began speaking, discussing an old pattern, one where she assumed his intentions based on her own past hurts, Leo felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The old Leo would have immediately launched into a defense, feeling misunderstood and compelled to argue for his purity of intent. He would have matched her volume, trying to out-reason her perceived injustice. But he paused. The gap appeared again. It was that silent, agonizing space between the trigger, her words, and the response. It felt unnatural, like stopping a physical momentum. His mind registered her narrative, accusation mixed with sadness. The immediate urge was to correct her, to point out the fallacy in her assumption of his character. He remembered the circle. Outside control, her feelings, her memories, her choice to speak that way today. Inside core, his judgment and his words. His primary task was not to convince her she was wrong, but simply to make sure he did not compound the disagreement with further defensiveness. The ensuing conversation unfolded as a delicate dance between truth and self-control. Leo learned to treat her statement not as an indictment of his soul, but merely as data, a reflection of her current emotional state. He observed the defensive posture, the slight flutter in her voice, and analyzed it dispassionately, like studying weather patterns. When she spoke of his perceived indifference, the first spark of anger flared up, hot and sharp. It was not that he felt indifferent. He had been preoccupied with building the capacity for genuine listening, which often required withdrawing himself internally. But to her ears, detachment sounded exactly like coldness. The impulse surged, demanding a protective retaliation. Yet, using the muscle memory gained from countless internal pauses, Leo forced the breath to his diaphragm. He did not react immediately. Instead, he listened, truly listened, allowing the stream of words to wash over him without attaching judgment to their substance. This was infinitely harder than arguing, because listening required him to temporarily suspend his own narrative and sense of righteous victimization. He shifted the focus from proving himself right to seeking mutual understanding. He began speaking not by defending his past actions, but by articulating his present principle, the commitment to viewing all people, including those he loved, through the lens of shared human frailty. He started with an acknowledgement of her pain, even if he disagreed with its premise. By validating her feeling without accepting the accusation as fact, he diffused the conflict's volatile energy. He stated, calmly and measuredly, that his primary goal was not to be understood in a historical sense, but to build a reliable foundation for the future, a foundation built on mutual respect, regardless of how complex or painful the conversation might feel. The exchange became an exercise in radical honesty, tempered by profound empathy. He had to speak the unvarnished truth about his internal struggle, that he was learning to be less reactive, slower to judgment, and more committed to inner peace than to winning a right. This confession of effort itself was revolutionary and deeply difficult. Clara's reaction, predictably, was messy. It involved tears, retreating silence, and a sudden, painful realization that his new self demanded too much emotional labor from her. The moment concluded not with an agreement or reconciliation, but with the quiet, heavy knowledge of effort. They had stated their respective principles to one another and accepted its resulting space of ambiguity. Leo walked away realizing that this difficult conversation was far more revealing than any physical ordeal. It required him to maintain his internal citadel while being breached by someone he cared for deeply. He did not achieve perfection, but he maintained sovereignty. He had chosen reason over the satisfying heat of argument. He had chosen principled calm over immediate emotional comfort. And in that sustained act of reasoned ascent toward difficulty, he finally began to forge a resilient self. A self capable of navigating the unpredictable current of human connection without losing its essential core. The journey has brought Leo to the precipice of perfect calm. He believes he has mastered the gap between thought and action, that by pausing, observing, and responding rationally, he is untouchable. Yet, life does not offer him an easy path to mastery. It offers him reality itself. The lesson has been about choosing a response, but true philosophical training requires accepting what simply is. Acceptance is not passive surrender. It is the hard work of acknowledging facts without immediately attaching judgment or hope to them. It is facing the raw, unadorned moment. His test arrives subtly, wrapped in the sudden withdrawal of something he had come to rely upon, not a physical thing, but a predicted outcome, a steady line drawn across his life's map. An opportunity, one that represented stability and recognition, simply evaporates. It is not lost due to error or lack of effort. It merely ceases to exist within the current flow of events. The blow is clean, definite, and utterly external. The initial reaction is a panicked spiral. The learned discipline of the pause fails him momentarily. His mind races through what-if scenarios. What did he say wrong? What assumption did he make about the future that was fatally flawed? He finds himself trapped in the agonizing loop of imagining alternate realities, each one more painful than the last. This is the deepest intellectual trap, the desire to rewrite the script simply because the current chapter is difficult to read. He attempts to deploy all his accumulated tools, the circle of control, the 3-second pause, even the cool detachment he learned from the cold water. But against the backdrop of true loss, these techniques feel brittle, like carefully stacked glassware in a sudden draft. He realizes that intellectual assent is insufficient when faced with emotional inevitability. The mind can agree logically that this event was outside his control, but the heart screams defiance, insisting that things should be different. The mentor reappears not to lecture, but simply to sit with him in silence during this period of uncontained anguish. There are no new frameworks provided, only a gentle, persistent reminder. Resistance is exhausting, and it changes nothing. The philosophy of acceptance, he finally grasps, demands radical presence. It means dismantling the emotional should statements that have governed his life. He must abandon the internalized narrative of how things ought to be in favor of acknowledging how they simply are. This shift is agonizing because for years he has defined himself by expectation, by the belief that virtue meant achieving certain outcomes. Now, his self-worth hangs suspended on his ability to find peace in an outcome devoid of triumph. Radical acceptance is thus understood not as resigning oneself to failure, but embracing the entirety of the present moment with clarity. It means viewing disappointment and loss not as personal assaults, but as fundamental elements of existence, as neutral data points that teach him about human impermanence. Every beautiful thing, every certainty he has built up, operates under the law of change. To truly accept what is to become fluent in the language of transience. He starts practicing accepting small truths, the inability to control a neighbor's loud music, the unchangeable passage of time, the fact that his own memories are inherently colored by his current mood. Each tiny acceptance acts like a shield, chipping away at the granite foundation of his worry. He learns that if he exhausts himself fighting reality, he simply loses all capacity to engage with it fully. The profound freedom arrives when he makes this shift, when he stops asking why me, and instead asks, what is happening right now? The anxiety collapses. The future ceases to be a demanding tyrant dictating his emotional state. He learns that peace isn't found in acquiring favorable circumstances. It is achieved by diminishing the emotional power of unfavorable circumstances. This acceptance transforms his relationship with life itself. Loss becomes merely information. Disappointment becomes a lesson in resilience, rather than proof of inadequacy. His ability to simply observe the world, the shifting colors of a sunset, the messy interaction at a market, without needing it to conform to his expectations, is perhaps the most profound form of inner quietude. He has moved beyond mere control and has reached a deeper state, congruence with reality. This acceptance does not make life easy. It makes him capable of navigating its inherent difficulty without losing his internal anchor. The journey to inner mastery is never a grand, single awakening. It is built in the quiet architecture of daily life. After confronting expectations, mastering anger, and accepting loss, one might assume that peace was found only when all external chaos ceased. But experience taught a deeper lesson. Stability is not the absence of challenge. It is the presence of reliable internal choice. The true measure of resilience does not appear in moments of crisis, but in the intentional routine before any crisis even begins. The mentor had been clear on one point that Leo struggled to integrate. He spoke often about owning your ascent, the conscious choice we make moment after moment to accept our judgments, and thus our suffering. But how do you own a judgment when life is already in motion? How does this profound philosophical discipline translate into the raw, messy physicality of waking up on a new day? This chapter sought not just deeper understanding, but structural change. Leo was asked to build a shield against the unknown by building it preemptively. He had spent weeks identifying what he could control and dedicating his focus there. Now, he had to apply that discipline to the transition from sleep to life, to the sacred yet often jarring moment of morning. The practice was simple in its requirement, monumental in its implication. The ritual of intention. It demanded more than mere preparation. It required a full mental rehearsal for the day's emotional topography. He had to mentally confront 3 specific potential adversities before his feet even touched the floor. Not theoretical struggles, but anticipated difficulties. The frustrating conversation with a colleague, the unexpected delay in travel, the sting of disappointing news. At first, it felt absurd. To treat tomorrow's worries as if they were mere models to be studied, stripped bare of their spontaneity. His mind resisted this act of preemptive discipline. The human tendency is to react spontaneously. We gather our emotional energy and spring into action. This ritual demanded the reverse, a calculated surrender before any input was given. He began by lying awake early, forcing himself into a state of hyper-awareness. He didn't visualize success. He did not conjure images of effortless perfection. Instead, he forced himself to dwell on potential failure. What if the meeting was hostile? What if his best effort failed to convince others? What if he spoke too soon and tasted regret? The deep work lay in developing the rational response for each imagined scenario. For the difficult conversation, he didn't rehearse arguments or clever retorts. He rehearsed silence. He mentally prepared to absorb perceived slights not as attacks against his worth, but merely as flawed projections of the other person's own internal turmoil. This was a monumental shift, transforming emotional reactivity into detached observation. For travel delays, he did not accept frustration or wasted time. Instead, he would calmly reframe the delay, a sudden opportunity to rest the mind, an enforced separation from the noise of urgency. He practiced recognizing the external event as completely neutral data, stripped of any implied negative judgment. The train was merely delayed. It was not a personal failure or a betrayal of schedule. This daily mental premortem became physically taxing. It required holding immense cognitive tension, a continuous stream of disciplined reasoning against the natural flow of anxiety. It meant cultivating a deep, almost boring patience with his own mind. He realized that by forcing himself to write down and prepare for setbacks, he was essentially robbing those potential events of their shock value. The surprise factor, which fuels panic, began to diminish. The consequence of this routine was a profound sense of radical self-trust. His inner landscape was no longer reactive, it was designed. He knew that regardless of the chaos outside, the unexpected call, the harsh word, the breakdown, he would not be controlled by whim or immediate emotion. The foundation he built in those quiet morning moments meant that when life hit him with a setback at noon, his rational response system had been exercised enough times that it responded automatically, calmly, and effectively. The ritual cemented what was learned across months of arduous practice. Freedom is not found in prediction or prevention, but in immediate reasoned assent. It is the internal architecture built to withstand impact. Leo understood now that true inner strength was not muscular, nor was it intellectual genius. It was simply the consistent, conscious choice to remain steady when every impulse screamed for reaction. He learned that the greatest act of power was the ability to greet the dawn, and every day after it, not with hope, but with resolute intention, ready only for what arrives, and equipped only with reason. The lessons accumulated over months of painful self-interrogation had prepared Leo for almost anything. He could face the cold water and remain detached. He could sit with profound grief and find his rational assent. He could endure the most frustrating conversations, prioritizing principle over immediate emotional comfort. But true mastery, he realized, required a shift in focus, away from his own internal battleground, towards the unpredictable theater of others. He found himself standing on the bustling pavement of a marketplace square. The air was thick with overlapping sounds, shouted bargains, the clatter of metal carts, the cheerful chaos of voices negotiating life's needs. This place was the antithesis of quiet contemplation. It was pure, unfiltered humanity in motion. In previous chapters, he had focused intensely on managing his own reactions to discrete events, the traffic jam, the unexpected slight, the rejection. Now, the sheer collective weight of human existence demanded a new level of discipline, observation without judgment. The initial experience was jarring. His honed inner focus, so powerful in solitude or during controlled exercises, suddenly felt insufficient against the tidal wave of competing lives unfolding around him. He watched a vendor arguing loudly over the price of fruit, interpreting the man's heightened emotion through a lens of his own recent struggles, a feeling that perhaps he should be more decisive, more assertive, like the vendors who commanded attention. He corrected himself quickly. That thought, that small whisper of judgment, was the very emotional attachment to external standards he had fought so hard to dismantle. He forced his mind back into neutrality. He wasn't observing a failure. He was simply observing an exchange of value and words. The lesson became deeply complex. It is not enough merely to manage one's internal state when confronted with the messiness of others. One must observe that the struggle, the anxiety, the minor crises unfolding in everyone else's lives are ultimately products of their own internal misjudgments, just as his own anxieties were. He saw a young woman struggling with an overloaded cart. Her face was marked by visible frustration, a tension around her mouth suggesting disappointment or fatigue. His automatic, untrained response would have been to offer unsolicited help, perhaps even critiquing the weight distribution or the path chosen. But he paused. He remembered the mentor's lesson on radical self-restraint and the power of the gap between stimulus and action. He realized that judging her burden, judging whether she was allowed to look exhausted or if she should be making more money, was an imposition stemming entirely from his own perceived sense of moral superiority. He was projecting his understanding of stoic resilience onto a stranger whose internal wiring he knew nothing about. This required immense mental discipline. It demanded viewing human experience not through the prism of personal improvement, but through the lens of detached anthropological study. They were all performing. They were all running from some invisible source of anxiety or toward some imagined goal. The cart was just a temporary obstacle in their current dramatic narrative. He noticed couples walking together, hands linked, yet separated by palpable emotional distance, a slight coolness in the shoulders, a refusal to meet eyes. He observed strangers rushing past him, their faces taut with urgent purpose, as if perpetually late for an appointment with fate itself. Every single person seemed trapped inside an invisible citadel of expectation and assumption. The core realization was that human life is rarely about external necessity. It is almost always about internal narrative. The shouting vendor wasn't merely arguing over fruit prices. He was wrestling with his own perceived value, needing the confirmation of another person's acknowledgement. The tired woman wasn't just burdened by a cart. She was struggling to reconcile effort with outcome. The quiet observation became an exercise in radical empathy, but not the kind that requires fixing or comforting. It was a purely intellectual recognition, accepting the fundamental incompleteness and imperfection of another consciousness from a distance. They were operating under assumptions about money, about time, about affection, about success, and these assumptions led them to act out their drama. This detached witnessing felt more taxing than any physical discomfort. The cold water had tested his muscles. The difficult conversation challenged his voice. Observing humanity required him to hold nothing back, no judgment, no expectation of outcome, and no desire to participate in the collective drama. It was a pure state of receptive awareness. He started seeing patterns, the same worried glance, the same defensive posture, the same slight tilt of the head that signaled disagreement, repeated across entirely different contexts and people. The physical setting changed, from the vibrant chaos of the market to the quiet anonymity of an office plaza in the afternoon. But the underlying emotional geometry remained consistent. His ability to observe others became a profound mirror for his own soul. By accepting the flawed, struggling nature of humanity as simply is, he simultaneously accepted the equally flawed and striving nature of himself when stripped bare of cultural expectations or personal vanity. He was not merely mastering stoicism for personal gain. He was becoming an impartial witness to the human condition itself. The final shift in perspective was one of liberation from comparison. When viewing others, his instinctual tendency had been to compare. Why are they doing that? I could do better. But through deep practice, this judgment dissolved into simple acknowledgement. They are doing what is necessary for them, right now, within the context of their own mistaken beliefs. He walked away from the square, not depleted by the noise, but subtly enhanced. He carried with him a profound quietude that was different from the meditative silence he had cultivated before. This new peace was earned in the public glare, found amid the ceaseless flux and flow of human imperfection. It was the calm heart of an observer, recognizing that every individual is performing their own difficult philosophical experiment, a fragile balancing act between desire and reality, and that his only job was simply to watch it unfold without attaching a single word of critique or expectation. The mastery of the self was not a monument built in a single day. After months spent wrestling with the internal battlefield, the sudden spike of anger, the paralyzing weight of expectation, the sting of unexpected loss, Leo understood that wisdom was not an achievement, but an ongoing act of return. He had conquered the minor triggers and weathered the great disappointments, yet true mastery required a shift from intense practice to seamless integration. His newfound philosophy could no longer remain confined to quiet rooms or mandatory exercises. It had to become the air he breathed, the ground beneath his feet, the texture of his ordinary moments. The vastness before him was a mirror of the inner landscape he had spent months mapping and charting. He stood at the edge of that quiet place, looking out over mountains meeting the slow burn of the setting sun. It felt like the end of a long climb, yet also the start of an endless journey. The mentor's voice, when it came again, was barely louder than the whispering wind through the valley grass, but its meaning resonated with the weight of absolute truth. He waited for the final lesson, prepared for the crowning moment of understanding. But what arrived was not a single piece of knowledge, nor a perfect formula to guarantee peace forever. It was a recognition of simple, relentless persistence. The greatest wisdom, he realized, was not a destination marked by an arrival sign. To believe it were would be to misunderstand the nature of human improvement itself. Stoicism, in its purest form, is nothing more than a continuous act of returning home, the return to oneself. It is the daily choice to re-establish sovereignty over the inner self when the world screams for attention. The journey was not defined by grand victories over enemies or perfect confrontations with misfortune. It was measured instead by the micro-moments, the 3 seconds before reacting in traffic, the quiet refusal to assume malice in a stranger's rushed glance, the willingness to sit still and endure the dull ache of a long wait. These small acts were the bedrock upon which resilience is built. He looked back over the path he had traveled. He remembered the frantic energy of his former self, chasing external validation, believing that outer control would bring inner calm. How foolishly he had lived within the belief that peace was something to be acquired, a prize at the end of the journey. The hard truth he now embraced was far simpler. Peace is not found, it is practiced. The wisdom he carried forward demanded a fundamental shift in perspective. It meant accepting that suffering does not originate in external events, but only within our own flawed interpretation of them. The mountain weather could rage, others could disappoint him with predictable pettiness, and the opportunities he craved might simply refuse to appear. Yet, armed with the tools, the pause, the inventory of gratitude, the radical non-judgmental observation, he found a bedrock of stability within his own mind. This life ahead would not be free of difficulty. In fact, realizing that freedom meant fully accepting inconvenience was perhaps the most difficult lesson all of them. Life is fundamentally messy. People will remain flawed, expectations will continue to build and collapse without warning, and the world itself will refuse neat categorization. That inherent chaos is simply reality. His true mastery lay not in avoiding this messiness, but in becoming entirely comfortable within it. To be a Stoic was to become an observer, a calm witness to the ceaseless drama of human existence. It meant recognizing that every external stimulus, whether a sharp word or a sudden downpour, is merely neutral information. It possesses no intrinsic moral weight. Only his reasoned assent lends it significance. The practice became one of radical anticipation and continuous calibration. Every morning was a fresh commitment to the self. Before stepping out into the unpredictable current of existence, he had to mentally prepare. He had to anticipate the potential disappointments, not with dread, but with sober acknowledgement. If today brings conflict in conversation, he will employ the 3-second pause. If it brings unexpected failure, he will treat it as mere data, nothing more. And if it brings discomfort, a physical or emotional slight, he will remember the cold water and remember that simply existing through the sensation is enough. This continuous self-correction was exhausting at times. It required a persistent vigilance against the seductive comfort of habit, the ease of emotional reaction, the natural inclination toward judgment. But he understood this discipline for what it was, not a shield against pain, but an internal strength that allowed him to withstand its blow without fracturing. The path forward required shedding any illusion of permanence or final mastery. He could never stop being human, susceptible to misunderstanding and emotion, yet he had learned the profound freedom inherent in acknowledging those weaknesses while simultaneously choosing the highest standard for his own response. It was a constant tug-of-war between instinct and reason. He walked away from that quiet place with no final answer, only an unwavering method. His life became a sustained dialogue with himself, to pause when the impulse strikes, to question the narrative of inevitability before he accepts it as truth, and to remain deeply appreciative even amidst scarcity. The ultimate realization was this: self-mastery is not a singular achievement. It is the humble fidelity to show up every single day and choose reason again. It is the choice to return, time and time again, to the core self that understands its own true boundaries, that only judgment resides within him, and thus only his disciplined assent has the power to define